the basement of our house had 1,400 malt cups in it with little sticks sticking out, and that's how we stood in all the vines.
Welcome to Funeral Potatoes and Wool Mittens, a show for people who embrace the warm and cozy spirit of everyday living in the Midwest. From the blog Random Sweets, I'm your host, Stacy Mergenthal. If you drink South Dakota-made wine or beer, Jim Schade and Eldon Nygaard are the guys to thank, because prior to the South Dakota 1996 Farm Winery Act legalized commercial production of wine in South Dakota, you couldn't make an alcoholic beverage in South Dakota and sell it, not since Prohibition. So Eldon came up with the idea to start a legal license for making and selling wine, wrote the legislation, and then Jim took it to the legislators at the state capitol in Pierre. It passed, and Eldon got the first license and began the state's first winery, Valiant Vineyards of Vermilion. 4 years after the bill passed, Jim and his wife Nancy founded Schadé Vineyard Winery west of Volga. In this amusing episode, Jim shares where he and Nancy fell in love with the wine industry and why he quit his job in Pierre before he applied for the third winery license in South Dakota. Plus, you'll learn why they hosted inventory reduction parties at their house, which two fruits don't work so well for winemaking, the funny story about how their winery got its name, how they became sponsors of the Iditarod, and how caller ID killed their original approach to picking grapes. Jim has handed the vineyard reins over to Dillon Ringling, even though Dillon broke all three of Jim's rules and now hosts weddings and events at the vineyard with the most beautiful sunsets as a backdrop. Jim, he is still pretty involved with the business, and having been on the ground floor of South Dakota wine since the late 90s, Jim admits that what he loves most about the winery hasn't been the wine. It has been about the people and relationships behind the pours. Jim Schade, welcome to Funeral Potatoes and Wool Mittens.
Thank you. Great to be with you, Stacy.
We're drinking our morning coffee together. But I think that's because we both agreed that we're an hour too early to start drinking wine, right?
That's 5 o'clock somewhere, you know.
Right. Although you and I can't see what's in your cup and you can't see what's in mine. So
That's true.
we could do a mini series on your life and the contributions that you've made to South Dakota, all the service projects that you've done. But today we're really going to mostly talk about, who knows where we're going to end up, but we're mostly going to talk about the vineyard and winery that you and your wife Nancy established back in 2000. Is that correct?
That's right. Yep.
2000. But before that even began, you had to do at least three very significant and monumental things. You had to, well, first of all, you had to help pass a new law in South Dakota. You had to then, because of that, and what you wanted to do for a future endeavor, you had to remove yourself from the job that you had at the time at the Department of Revenue. And then you had to purchase some land and move back to where you kind of grew up, if I understand. Well, I know that you were from around the Volga area because you used to wrestle Jan Sanderson.
That's right. I was much heavier than him, though.
Different weight class, right?
Yep.
For people who haven't been lucky enough to know you, to meet you, just introduce yourself and your family. And
Jim and Nancy Schade, we've been married, actually, it's 51 years now. We met at college, and we started a family, 2 sons, Reed and Ross, both engineers. We moved a lot. I think while we were in college, we moved, I think it was 11 times in like 8 years or something like that. So we were pretty mobile. We had worked at camps in the summertime, Bible camps, and then we came back to college, and then we quit twice to actually make money to go back to college, which you could actually do back in those days. You could actually make enough at a job to
yeah,
go off, and you could afford college again. And we just did one. I think our total debt was $2,500 when we were thinking, how are we ever going to pay that back?
Oh my God. And that doesn't even cover a semester now. Hardly books.
That's right. So we started out, and we ended up moving to California. We were in the ag industry, and in the late 80s or early 80s, and the ag industry just fell flat on its face. The interest rates went to 22%, and it was horrible here. People were getting sold out. It was terrible. So we thought, well, we're going to go to California. Got a job with a company that did financial planning for farmers. And so my degree is in ag economics, and so it really fit. And so we went out there and we helped farmers, big farmers, put together cash flows for their lenders to show that, yes, we can pay these loans back. And so was there for a year and lived in Sacramento, and that's only hour and a half away from the Napa Valley, which I always loved wine. And so when people came to visit us, that was a natural trip to the Napa Valley. And we would, go through the tastings and got to know some of the owners of the vineyards. One of them was Jack Cakebread. You ever heard of Cakebread wines? He was about as small as we were when we started, working out of a garage kind of a deal. And he's become extremely successful. His wine is only sold in restaurants now around the country. And so we got to know him. And I think our favorite winery was Trefethen. And during the Reagan administration, he bought all their wine for the White House. So they had no wine for sale at Trefethen. We got to know the industry and got to know the people, but the costs were just astronomical. I mean, the crazy prices for land out there was, it makes South Dakota look like a, poorhouse. Vineyards selling for, $25,000 an acre back then. And now, of course, they're $100,000 an acre because it's, the joke is if you want to make $1 million in the wine business, you start with $5 million. And
sound advice.
It's a good place to launder money, I think. But anyway, we just fell in love with it and was recruited back to South Dakota by Sheldon Cotton, who I'd worked for in college on his farm. I helped with the grain operation. He had a big Angus cattle operation, and I worked there. He was lived a mile and a half from where I grew up, and so worked there. I think I knew him for 55 years. We became friends, and fast friends, and worked for him off and on over the time, all through college and after college. So, but he was appointed by Janklow to be the Commissioner of School and Public Lands. There was a move by the state to close the School and Public Lands office, and the Supreme Court says no, you don't. And so so he was appointed to fill that position. The School and Public Lands manages a school trust of $100 million. Back in those days, I'm sure it's way more than that now, but every student gets money, every school gets money per student based on that. And that came from land sales. The state was given every section 16 and 36 in the state for school purposes, and those lands were sold. A lot of them were sold. Some are still leased today. Some have oil on them, and all that money goes to education in South Dakota. So it's a very small office, but got a huge significant part of it of the state the state support for education. And actually that office is also basically the real estate agent or the register of deeds for the state. So all state property flows through that office. And so it's called the Public Land Trust. And so wherever the state land, the deed is held at the School and Public Lands. So it's a very important, very obscure. Most people don't know anything about it, but it's still, every student in South Dakota gets, at that time, it was about around $100 per student, no matter the size of the school, whatever. And then we always thought it really covered textbooks for students all over the state. So it was a great system. But and back to the wine. Since we'd gotten so much, just fell in love with wine, we started making wine in our basement, and found a grower that was growing grapes outside of Pierre down by Joe Creek. And I didn't know grapes grew in South Dakota. I had no clue. And so we'd go over there, and they were very elderly, and we'd help them prune. And then they give us some of the grapes, and we'd take them back to our house and make wine out of them. And after I left School and Public Lands, went to the Department of Revenue, and it was called Special Taxes, where I oversaw the taxation of alcoholic beverages. And what the strange thing we've discovered is that since Prohibition, you couldn't make an alcoholic beverage in South Dakota and sell it. So 100% of all beer, wine, liquor came from out of state, which seemed ludicrous. Why does this all have to be imported? And so
So hold on a second. So if anybody made wine or beer in South Dakota, they couldn't sell it at all?
they couldn't sell it at all.
Just within
Nope,
the state, or they couldn't?
anywhere. Because it wasn't, you have to be a license, and the state didn't have a license for making alcohol. Now, under the federal provision, since there was no provision under the state, under the federal provision, you can make 200 gallons a year for personal consumption.
Could
And
you
so the
drink that
joke
much?
was at our house is that we'd have to have inventory reduction parties every now and then to get below the legal limit. And so at those parties, people started to say, "Hey, this is pretty good. You ought to try selling it." And I said, "Well, I can't. We can't in South Dakota. Besides, I work for the Department of Revenue. They won't give me a license if there was such a license." So it kind of went on that way for years. I think people thought we were dealing drugs because all of a sudden there'd be a 25-pound bag of sugar on our steps, or tubs of rhubarb, or one time we got a pickup load of watermelon. I mean, it was just crazy. People would bring us fruit, and we'd try to make wine out of it.
And this was still back when you were in Pierre, when you were
Still in
working for the
Pierre.
state. Okay. Mm-hmm.
And so when I went to work for the Department of Revenue, Jankel appointed me, or I guess Mickelson actually appointed me right before the plane crash. He appointed me to be the director of that division, and so I oversaw all that stuff. But basically, it's the taxation of everything except gasoline and sales tax. So it was all the other taxes were underneath that office, and the alcohol tax which was paid by the wholesalers, because your person couldn't bring in and pay tax on it. You had to come through a wholesaler. So Eldon Nygaard of Vermilion, Valiant Vineyards, came up with the idea of let's start a legal license for making wine and selling it in South Dakota using South Dakota produce. And so I was part of that drive. And I knew the legislators very well because I was so involved in property taxes. And that was always a hot button in South Dakota. So I was able to lobby. I never wore a badge for this. I was able to lobby the legislators. And Eldon came up with the idea, let's call it a farm winery license, which means that every ag legislator had to vote for it. And the wholesalers just fought us tooth and nail. They did not want to give us one scrap out of the liquor industry in South Dakota, but we got it passed. And
Sorry, who did you say fought you tooth and nails for that?
Liquor wholesalers.
The liquor wholesalers. Okay.
Liquor and beer wholesalers.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't want one scrap of anything. And of course, liquor wholesalers import all the wine. And so they handle all the wine. So they bring it in trucks, they deliver it to the liquor stores or wherever, restaurants, wherever it's sold, and then they're responsible for the tax, the excise tax on alcohol.
Sure.
So it got passed, and I really wanted to sneak in and get license number 1, but I knew it'd just torque off Eldon so bad because he was actually the instigator. I helped, but he was the instigator. So I very applied for number 2, and I applied for number 3, and then I resigned first from the Department of Revenue, and then I applied for license number 3.
Okay.
And it held it for about a year before we did anything. At that time, the license was only $100. And so, and that's when we moved back to Volga and started building our home where the winery is now. And so we'd spent a year building it ourselves. Our sons and godchildren were the employees, and we had a contractor that worked by himself, and we built it. It took us 9 months to build the place. And we never dreamed that we'd have a winery there. I mean, we just loved wine, and we, kind of on, I moved some of the plants that I had started out in Pierre from the vineyard out there to take cuttings, and you can start them in like a cup, get them growing, and then plant them out in the yard. And so I'd had several of those plants, so I moved a bunch of them in my backyard in Pierre and moved them to Volga and started, a very small vineyard in a garden spot. And then they grew so well, and then moved them down into the vineyard with a tree mover, and then started taking cuttings off them, and eventually ended up with 1,400 plants. The basement of our house had 1,400 malt cups in it with little sticks sticking out, and that's how we started all the vines. we took them other vines. And so we started that vineyard, and then we thought, well, we got our license. Let's try selling some wine. And so we thought, well, we'd be open for a couple hours on Saturday or something like that. And it just got completely out of hand. We didn't have wine for ourselves at Christmas for 5 years. I mean, we sold every drop of wine we ever made. And so we just started making more. And then we had individuals starting plant vineyards. They saw what was going on. They said, would you buy our grapes if we planted grapes? I said, sure we would. And so that's how it grew. And so our claim to fame is that we only use South Dakota produce. The only exception of that was cranberry. I can't find any cranberry bogs in South Dakota, so we got them in Wisconsin. But everything else was locally grown. And so that was our pride of our business, is that we only made from South Dakota produce. And none of the other wineries could really make that claim. So we were a little different. And so that's how it really started. And then since we're a wholesaler now, because we are a winery, they gave us the wholesale part of that too, so we could go directly to the stores and sell wine to them. And how it got crazy, because the people that would come to our tasting room, they'd come to SDSU or to Brookings for some reason and tasted wine, and they said, how come we can't buy your wine in Rapid City? I says, go to your store where you buy your alcohol from, and tell them to call us. We'll bring them some. And that's how it started. We ended up getting over 130 stores that way. We never went out and marketed a drop. The stores called us and said, hey, can we hear your wine sells real well? And we said, sure, yeah, we'll get it for you. And that's how it grew. And that's how it really got out of hand. And so we started, every 5 years, we'd build a building. We'd outgrow that. Another 5 years, we'd build another building and outgrow that. So it just got to be a huge, and I think our best year, we sold 6,500 cases of wine. Part of that also is we opened a tasting room in Deadwood. And so we had a tasting room out there for 5 years. And it became very difficult to manage a business 400 miles away. So we actually closed it in 2012, raised our prices a little, and made the same amount of money with making less wine. So it all worked out. We were so cheap I think we sold it for $7 a bottle when we started. It was so cheap. And
that doesn't play well into that $5 million. So I want to know, your last name is Schadé.
Yep.
And this is Schadé Vineyard and Winery. Tell me about that name. Who came up with naming it that and turning it into this foxy name that it is?
Well, it's Ron Woodburn is the guy's name. He worked for Ag and Natural Resources, or we call it Dirt and Water in those days, but it's Ag and Natural Resources Division in Pierre. And we really started on it's called a GIS, a Geographic Information System, where we cataloged the whole state of South Dakota. And my part of it was the public land, is that you could go to a computer and see the public land, see the right-of-ways, see the topography, see the soil types, all those things. And so we were really infants in that, and he was a computer whiz. And so we just became fast friends. He wanted to do it for, they call it point source pollution or something like that. And he was doing it to decide, how we can keep, cattle waste out of the Sioux River or something like that. I mean, that was his charge. And so I was the public land guy. And so we traveled a lot together to different conferences and tried to figure out how to had 3 people from SDSU that worked on it for years with us. And we just became a fast friends. And he knew I was making wine in our basement. And so he says, you can't have a name, you can't have a shady wine. So he nicknamed me Schade, and it stuck. And so everybody started calling me Schade. And then Nancy, for my 40th birthday, had a label made. And that inscription of Schade was done by Nancy Gordon from Pierre. She's a graphic artist, and she created that for us, and it's still on every bottle today. So
still the same.
That was 30 years ago. So it's still the same. That's the brand. So that's how it got to be. And Schade is a German, Schade, which is caution or road hazard. And so roadkill would not be a good idea for having
roadkill wine. What?
There's a roadkill bar in Sturgis, but that's a little bit different a genre that we were thinking about.
All right. And so now your vineyard is growing and thriving. What was the first wine that you made and called?
Well, it was definitely rhubarb. I mean, because we could get it. We used to go up and down the back alleys of Volga, after people had enough rhubarb that they could stand. And we would just say, "Can we have your rhubarb?" And they'd say, "Absolutely, come and get it." So we'd fill pickup loads of rhubarb and take it and crush it and then press the juice out and make rhubarb wine. And then we'd go to Sanderson and get strawberries. And that's when I got a good, knew him from wrestling. That's when I found out that he had acres of rhubarb. And the time I went to see was right after a hailstorm, and it just got hammered. And I said, "We can still use this if we pick it right away. It's not going to go bad. Just pick it, and we'll harvest it, and we'll make wine out of it." And that's how it started. So we've been getting rhubarb from Sanderson for years. He is the rhubarb king.
He
He
is.
is the rhubarb king. So that we started with that, and then our grapes weren't old enough to start. It takes 3 years to get wine from, or grapes from. They take that long to maturity, actually, where you're going to get some grapes to pick. And so by rhubarb wine, choke cherry, all the different kinds of fruits you could get, apple wine, all those kind of fruits we could get readily, but we couldn't get grapes, and we didn't want to import from out of state.
Mhm.
So we just decided to wait. And so when we started making grape wine, it was we took all the grapes we had. We had like 4 different varieties, and we made wine. Took all the grapes and made one kind of wine. It's called Oakwood Red, and that's still the
This
top.
one. Look what I have right here, a bottle of Oakwood Red.
It's still the top seller at the winery. It's our first real grape wine, and we still use that same blend of grapes to make that. So that recipe has been there for over 20 years.
Over 20 years. Yep. This is a great bottle. I think we bought a couple of these when we were there this summer. And then
Mm-hmm.
another one, I had to bring wine bottles into my office. I thought it was only appropriate. And then one of them that I picked out was the choke cherry.
Yep. Yep.
Now I have to, oh, go ahead.
Well, there's so many people that stole choke cherry wine out of their grandpa's crock in the basement. The, the grandpas made wine back in South Dakota, and everybody had stolen a bottle out of their grandpa or something, and they'd come and say, "This tastes just like what my grandpa used to make." And so we just sold scads of it. And Hutterite colonies would pick the choke cherries for us. They'd bring them, we'd process them and turn them in. A choke cherry itself it's a gigantic seed with a little paste around it. I mean,
Yeah.
as bitter as can be, but it makes it just a wonderful wine, a real light wine. So that became one of our top sellers too. It's just from choke cherries, and just everybody, so many people stopped and would say, "Oh, this tastes just like grandpa's," So they'd buy cases for Christmas.
Yeah. This one's really good. So I have to admit that I love sparkling wine. So well, not all my life, but probably before I was old enough to drink, I tried to like wine, and I could not like wine no matter what. And then for one Christmas, I was at my Aunt Marilyn's, and she served a sparkling wine. And I was like, I can drink this. This is really good. So then I started drinking and trying all different kinds of sparkling wines. And when we went to your tasting room, well, I say yours, but Dillon Ringling is the new owner. So we'll get to that part. But we went to the tasting room this summer, and I was a little skeptical because I was like, if you don't have sparkling wine, I don't know if I'm going to like any of them. But we did the flights. And
Mm-hmm.
I love that concept, first of all, of having a sheet of paper in front of me that explained all the different wines we could pick. What was it, 5 or
Yeah.
6?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That we wanted to try. And Sage, she was working that day, and she would pour it up and then explain a lot about it and give us some information and taste notes of things. And I mean, I came out of there with at least 4 that I really liked.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we bought a bunch of bottles of wine, and it's fantastic. So if somebody's listening and like, "Oh, that's great, but I don't really like wine, or I only drink sparkling wine or something," these are, for some reason, they are just different and really good.
That was actually our goal, is to, they were in California, and of course everybody wants this deep, smoky, red, heavy wine, and everybody's just trying to make that. And we just try to do something different, for people who do not like that. And that's a whole
Hmm.
lot of people. and the comment was continual. We don't like wine, but we like yours. And we did that on purpose because we'd experienced that in California. I love a good, great Cabernet. I mean, I love all that, but we try it. We try one of our aces and eights, which is the Dead Man's Hand from Wild Bill Hickok. When we had the tasting room in Deadwood, we had an aces and eights wine. And that was probably our driest and it was aged in oak. It was our attempt. I don't think it couldn't match anybody from California, but it's when people wanted a dry wine, hey, we got one, give it a try. But it's not, South Dakota grapes gets technical in tannins in South Dakota or cold climate grapes is so much higher than California. The juice is so soft in California compared to our juice that comes from our grapes. And it's the tannin contact. That's the bite that you get in the back of your throat when you're drinking a really dry wine. That's the tannin. And that comes from the skin of the grape. And so the longer you give it the juice, by the way, the inside of a grape is clear. There's the color comes from the grape skin. And so when you crush it, it gets the color of the skin. And so the green grapes and green disappears in the fermentation process. So you get a white wine. And the red wines, depends on how much time they had contact with the outside of the skin, turns it into a redder wine. Well, in California, they'll crush them and start fermenting them with the skins having that contact for 6-7 days. If we did that with our grapes, it'd turn your face inside out. It'd be so strong with tannins. So we had very little skin contact, and that's the secret. I'll never tell how long that skin got, because we played with that for years.
Okay.
Found what we thought was a good wine.
Well, you definitely did. I did want to ask you how the weather in South Dakota, because obviously it's so different than California. And I do think how many years ago I learned, oh my gosh, people are growing grapes, and actually these wineries in South Dakota are growing, in some instances, growing their own grapes, which we don't think of in South Dakota because we have winter. But I wanted to know how the weather plays a part in the varieties that are made that you make here.
Well, these are all hybrids, and in most of their genealogy is a wild mountain grape somewhere, which can survive. I know one of the breeders took a wild mountain grape from Montana and crossed it with a Lambrusco, and came up with its Valiant grape. It's created here by Ron Peterson, actually in Brookings. He created the Valiant grape, and it's still probably the most winter hardy. It'll take 40 below like a cool day, But the problem is that vinifera from California cannot take this weather. They would not survive. A Cabernet or Merlot wouldn't have a chance here. First, it wouldn't be ready till Thanksgiving because the growing season takes so much long, and it'd be rock hard by then because it'd be frozen. So that's where ice wine comes from, by the way. So anyway, these are all hybrids, and some of the plant breeders, Elmer Swenson from La Crosse, Wisconsin. In fact, that vineyard out in Pierre, where we got grapes from, was some of his cuttings that this couple had gotten from him. It was kind of his West test plot, because Pierre is in such a different growing zone than La Crosse, Wisconsin. And so he had him out there, and that's where we got a lot of his grape varieties. And then we took some of those cuttings and started our vineyard. So it all comes, Ron Peterson, University of Minnesota, Cornell, a lot of these universities did some plant breeding and came up with these. And we became a member of the Minnesota Grape Growers, and it's an international organization. It's cold climate grape people, which is every country above the equator, basically. It's where it freezes, it gets very cold. And so we all work with the same fruit, and they have an association meeting every year up in Minneapolis, and you learn a lot about what doesn't work. Actually, you find out what doesn't work. You have all these great ideas, but you can find out what doesn't work. And so that became a great resource for it. And I actually went to UC Davis in Davis, California, University of California, Davis, to their enology program, went through their week program, which was good, but their techniques don't fit with South Dakota grapes. They don't. I had to learn it. I had to figure it out myself with trial and error. And so I've made a good share of some great drain cleaner over the years. I have made good drain cleaner. It's undrinkable. So it's poured down the drain.
Is there any fruit or anything that you've tried that didn't work? So you said you use your grapes, rhubarb, raspberries, apple, strawberries. What
Well,
else?
the two that come to mind are watermelon. Like I said about that story
Oh
about
yeah.
a pickup load of the secretary for the governor uh, brought us a pickup load. Her husband was a farmer out there and had irrigation, and he planted the corners to watermelon, and so they had thousands of watermelons, and so they brought it. Mary Bisson was her name. She said, "Hey, you ever tried watermelon wine?" And no, so we tried it, and so Nancy and I were cutting up watermelon in our garage, flies everywhere.
Oh.
It was, it was horrible, and crushed it and turned it into a wine, and it was the most lovely white wine. It was spectacular, and I've tried it 4 times since, and it's failed, absolutely failed. It's like I found the cure for cancer. Now I can't figure it out again. Now, I mean, it was just spectacular, and now I've tried it with better equipment, with more sanitary, everything. Maybe it's the flies that
I was
made
gonna
it bad.
say,
I
did you
don't
have the
know.
same amount of flies? You shouldn't have been doing it sanitary again.
So I've tried many times, and it's just been a failure. So I just quit. And the other one is plum, wild plum. Now it makes apricot. Wild plum makes a wonderful wine, but it's horrendous to pick and takes, you know, thousands of pounds to make any kind of quantity. But
Mhm.
apricots was one we thought would be a fun one. And it, I mean, I think it was 7 years old and it still hadn't cleared up.
Oh,
It tasted good, but it was like fog, looking through
oh,
the fog, and nobody will buy that if it's foggy, And so we
right.
gave it. Some people just loved it, and we said, if you come and volunteer, we'll give you give you apricot wine. For coming to help us. There you go. We'll be there.
How far away have you shipped your wines?
Actually, Alaska. We became Larson. I come up with his first name, Larson. He grew up in Arlington, and he was on the Iditarod committee. Wells Fargo was a supporter of the Iditarod. He worked for Wells Fargo, and Vern Halter from Flandreau became a musher up there, and these two became friends. And Mr. Larson and Vern would travel to schools and put on the program, the Iditarod program for sixth graders. They traveled all over South Dakota doing this trips. Well, Mr. Larson stopped at our winery one day and said, "Do you know any California wineries that would consider being sponsors of the Iditarod?" And I says, "Hey, what are you talking about? How about us?" And he said,
Right.
"Yeah." So we did. So we'd ship pallets of wine up to the Iditarod, and we'd have pictures of the mushers and put them on the bottles, and then
Oh,
they'd sell them at auction. And the highest price bottle we sold was $2,300. It
wow.
wasn't because of the wine. It was because of the picture of the lady that actually he's passed away. That was a musher and just became very, very Susan Busher from actually her husband was from South Dakota, but she was a
Oh.
musher, died of leukemia, I believe. But we'd put 3 bottles. I think it was 5 bottles, and we'd give the musher 1 bottle. We'd have them sign the bottles, then we'd auction them off at
Oh.
it's called the pre. Like 2,500 people show up at the Denai Center in Anchorage, and it's the kickoff of the Iditarod, and it's a fundraiser. And so we donated the wine, and all the money went to the mushers. And so over the years
Okay.
we gave over $75,000 to the mushers at the Iditarod. And so we shipped pallets, but we'd have to a semi would come and pick it up. It'd go on a freight truck to Seattle, go on a boat. It had to be a heated boat so it didn't freeze, because the banquet's in first weekend in March. So you had to get it up there in the wintertime, and then we'd fly up with it, and then we'd unwrap it and display it. And I mean, it was a gas. We became VIPs at the Iditarod. It was so fun. It was so
It's a
fun.
really cool story. I just didn't
It
know
is.
anything
That's
about
how,
that.
and we did that for 6, 7 years. And unfortunately, one of the board members decided that they shouldn't be selling alcohol. Alcohol is a really huge issue in Alaska with the Inuit people. It's really huge. In fact, I
Oh.
had to get licensed to serve alcohol at that. We did tastings at that banquet, And the fine for selling to giving wine to an underage person is $1,000. You know, and so you had to be certified to be able to pour wine, and they're very, very cautious about alcohol in Alaska. And so we had to kind of learn. And then we had a couple mushers that were recovering alcoholics, and so they decided to quit doing it. You know, but
Okay.
I mean, I understand that. I get it. I
Right.
get it.
You
But it
still
was
have the
so fun.
stories to tell now.
It, it was so fun to meet the mushers. I mean, I get to present them the check every year at their musher meeting. And one year I had them uh, hello to Mickelson Middle School in Brookings because I was giving a program there after I got back from the Iditarod. And so I had all the mushers say, hello, Mickelson Middle School sixth graders. They were just all pumped about that. So it was really a fun program. You know,
Yeah.
it's just fun.
Let's go to the process, sort of how you process. I was out at Schade Vineyard yesterday and you showed me the piece of equipment that you use to pick the grapes. Do you call it pick the grapes?
Yep.
But walk
Yep.
through how when the grapes are ready, because you also showed me some that were past ready and they were actually looked like raisins.
Mhm. Yep.
Tell me how what the
There's
process
well, the
is.
grape itself, there's a sweet spot we're looking for. And part of it is sugar, part of it is acid. When grapes are maturing, the acid level is way high. I mean, you just can't, it's just like lemon juice. It's so tart. And
Hmm.
then at the same time, when they're maturing, the sugar level rises. And where the sugar level gets to like 22 bricks or 22% sugar, and the acid comes down to like 3.2 pH, that's the sweet spot where we want to pick them. And so before we had that harvester, we'd ask people to come and help us, which caller ID killed us because when the Shady's called in September, I know I got a root canal. I think I'll go do that instead. I mean, it's fun to pick once, but 4 or 5 years into it, we just couldn't get enough volunteers. And so I found that machine in Texas. It was a raisin orchard, and it was hardly used. Bought it out of an estate and shipped it up here, and then we've been using it for like 12 years, and it's just it picks a person can pick about 500. A good person can pick about 500 pounds a day, an 8-hour day, which is a lot of pails full of grapes. But you shatter so many they fall on the ground. And you're
Oh,
reaching in, cutting the vine and pulling out the cluster because they're so ripe. The machine does a much better job, and we can do 5,000 pounds an hour with that thing. I mean, it's just it moves about as fast as you can walk, and it virtually picks every grape, and there's
hmm.
very little shatter on the ground. So I mean, they made grape harvesters they're pretty smart people that built these, and so that's what we use. So that we get the grapes, and that harvester shakes them off the cluster, so we don't even get the cluster. We just get the individual grapes, and then they go into a tank, and then we run them through a crusher destemmer, where there's a set of rubber rollers that just pop the skin, and then
Hmm.
takes any debris out. If there's any leaves or any twigs or something like that, it's got a process where it can get it. So you're just getting, after they're crushed, it's juice and pulp. And
Okay.
so, depending on the kind of wine we're making, we'll press that. Some of it we'll press immediately, like all the whites we press immediately, and press the juice out and discard the pulp. So what's left is what you have is juice, pulp, and seed and skin. And so, like I was telling you earlier, this skin contact is where the color comes from. So depending on what we're making, the
That's
amount of time,
proprietary.
yep,
Yeah.
how much time we leave on. But the whites are all pressed immediately. Yeast is thrown in, and they mature very quickly. We got to a point where most of our wine was 2 and 3 years old before we actually bottled it. And we just found the
Oh.
quality just went through the roof when you could age it in tanks, in the dark, in a temperature controlled building. The product was just so much better. And that was really what the process. So we kind of fell into figuring out how to
Mhm.
do this place. And we didn't have a lot of money, so we didn't go buy stainless steel tanks. And, we went to auction sales where dairy industry and they're all stainless steel. You could buy, if it had a dent in it, you could buy it for $100. I never told the wine it was dented. So we were able,
Right.
we're able to, we bought, we call ourselves dumpster divers. We went to places that had quality equipment, but it was absolutely thrown away by big dairies. That's how and like I said, we did, stainless steel, if you buy a new one, it's about $10,000 or $1,000 a gallon, so you can spend tons more $100 a gallon. You can spend on a 1,000-gallon tank. My gosh, that's $10,000. It's just insane. And you need lots of them. So
Yeah.
why isn't enough? So we went to totes, food grade totes, and they hold 1,000 liters, about a little over 275 gallons. And that's what we used. And at one time we had 130 of them full of wine. And so that's why we had to keep building buildings. We kept getting our inventory kept going up. I couldn't say no to growers. That was my weakness. I bought too many grapes. And actually it turned out, luckily, because we opened that tasting room in Deadwood and sold it all, sold every drop. So it really worked out well.
And so you're actually bottling on site as well.
Yep.
Right.
We pitch the yeast, takes about 2 to 3 weeks. It's like baking bread. The yeast is converting the sugar into carbon dioxide and alcohol. In bread, you bake the alcohol away, but but it produces heat, carbon dioxide, and alcohol. And at a certain level, the alcohol gets high enough, it kills the yeast. And that's a stable wine. That's typically the yeast I use were about 12 to 14% is where they would stop fermentation on their own. And then the pulp continues to settle, which is called lees, on the bottom of the tank. And then we would pump the clear wine off the top into another tank and do that a couple of 3 times a year. It's called racking. And then we'd age it. And then when we got ready to bottle, we would blend several tanks, like we do Frontenac and Sabrevaux and St. Croix to make one kind of wine. We'd use Valiant and Frontenac for another kind of wine. And that's where the tasting, Nancy was just exceptionally good at tasting wine. And she would dog me if it didn't taste like last year's. I had to absolutely mimic last year's wine because she said, I can sell that. So one night we were sitting at our kitchen table and I had all these bottles of wine out there and we're tasting them and I had different blends of different wines and we were toasted by the time we got there.
That's what I was just thinking.
Walked in the bedroom. Man, this wine's getting better every minute here. And that's the other story is that, we got big enough when Nancy worked at SDSU and she's a coordinator of disability services for SDSU for students and staff. And so we're sitting one night talking about how it had grown. And I said, one of us has got to quit our jobs and do this full time. And she said me first. I was too slow on the uptake. So she quit her job and became the marketing and the tasting room manager for Schade. I had a job where I very flexible. I met with donors for the Lutheran Church and I could meet with them when it fit for them. Lots of more nights, some were weekends. I was at churches on weekends. So I was very flexible. So at harvest time, I could, devote great time and winemaking time in the winter. Did a lot of it in the winter time where a lot of the donors are to the south anyway. So I was able to be flexible. So my job worked perfect for it. And then eventually I retired from that and became full-time. And then eventually we can't do this anymore. And so Dillon was one of the employees and we were going to just quit making wine and sell everything, all our inventory and just live there. And then he asked if he could, would be interested if he could buy it from us. So we made him a deal he couldn't refuse. Because wineries don't sell. That's the thing we found out. Wineries don't sell in this country. I mean, because they have a personality of one person, and their clientele based on that. The relationships is what I think our strong point is, building the relationships with people across the state. It was, I just love people and their stories and hear what they're coming from, why they're involved, why they're in Brookings, what are they, how many kids you got, all that kind of stuff. What do you do for a living? I mean, that was just so fun to do that at, in a tasting room,
Yeah.
Of course, in South Dakota, we all know somebody that knows somebody. I know a guy that knows a guy, or we're all related or something.
Yeah.
So,
and you said you love people, but people love you too. So when I first met you, it was maybe 10 years ago or so, because you and I were both serving on the Brookings Chamber Board together. And David Mearhabe was the CEO of the chamber at the time. And I know he at one time told me I was a table thumper, which I didn't really understand, but I do understand what that means now. And
Oh, I do.
I do believe that you are the same type of person. And we did a lot of projects together. And I think didn't we hired Kelsey, the new CEO,
Yep,
together. You served as
yep.
the interim CEO while we were trying to replace David. And but it was always a pleasure working with you and have enjoyed all your stories and but so Dillon, I want to go back just a minute to that. So Dillon Ringling, is that am I saying
Yes,
his last name right?
yes.
Yeah, when I pulled these bottles of wine this morning and looked at the back, I'm like, oh yeah, Dillon Ringling, the winemaker. So did you used to have your name on the back?
Yes. Yep.
Just trying to remember. I don't have any old enough bottles.
When he worked with us and eventually came to the idea of buying it, and I hadn't made wine for years. He was doing it all. I mean, he
Oh,
picked it up so quickly. And so then when he bought it, so well, you got to put your name on it. You've been the winemaker for a couple of years. He would do all the tests, all the stuff you got to do
yeah.
to figure out when the wine is matured, all that kind of good stuff. So he was doing that routinely, and so that's why he put his name on the bottle then.
Yep,
Yeah, our
yep.
name was on it before.
Okay. And how's that going? I mean, you haven't retired. You've been picking
Well,
the last few days and you're out there and you still have pretty heavy involvement in Schade Vineyard Winery.
I say that when they're really hard up for help, they call me.
Then they call you Jim.
Yeah. No, I help with the finances yet. The taxes are just a nightmare with the feds in the state. Not only sales tax, but excise tax and label approval. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff, and it's not something you can consume in a weekend. So that's why I stay part of that because
Easier to learn how to make wine.
yeah, and how to yeah. But I did all the bureaucratic stuff because I was the bureaucrat for many years and made people do all these stupid things. So I understand it. I was the problem for many years for people.
You were that guy. They didn't want to answer your call then either.
So yeah, let's stay involved, and as long as I can, I will. And the thing that happened to us is that we had three rules at the winery when we were running it. It said no weddings is number one, number two is no weddings, and number three, refer to rule 1 and 2. We just
Now there's
refuse to
weddings
do
out there
weddings.
every weekend.
Yeah, and I just said, I don't need 250 drunk people on my backyard at Saturday night. I really don't need this. So we just denied it. Just said, no, we don't do weddings. And finally, one of our employees, uh, Erica Cotton, wanted to get married to us. And of course, she worked for us for years. And okay, we can have a wedding. And it was crazy success. And then Dylan's sister got married at the winery. And so we'd had 2 weddings, and the phone never stopped ringing. It just rang. Hey, can we have our wedding out there? and that's how we agreed. Yeah, Dylan, go ahead. So he turned it into a wedding venue, and it's just been absolutely. There was 2 groups there yesterday booking weddings for next year, and it's almost full already for next year.
Mhm.
So some weekends they do 2 weddings on a weekend. I mean, it's just been phenomenal, and turned a house into an Airbnb or to a Airbnb, and so the wedding party typically moves in there. It's just been
Mhm.
he's done some things that we never could have done. His youth and energy, and he can build anything. He is just a craftsman at
Oh,
almost anything, and so he's always improving or building something. So it's been a great relationship. We're so fortunate that he came to work for us. And a lot of our students, Nancy grew up near Platte, actually at New Holland, South Dakota. And so a lot of our employees, the family that knew her says, hey, when you're at college, Shady's got a winery up there. You probably get a job there. And they come out. We never advertised for an employee ever. And these
oh my
kids
gosh.
come out and they just say, my mom knows your mom. And, she said, I'd like to learn how to do work here, and we had over 100 employees over those years, and we never recruited a one. They all just showed up, and we always said when we knew they were a great employee is when they said, when we make the wine. It didn't say when that guy makes the wine. It was when we make the wine. We
Oh,
knew we had the right employee. That was
yeah.
really the test of when they said they took ownership in the quality. It really
Hmm.
became, really became like
Hmm.
those kids We had one from England, one from France, one from Honduras. We've gone to see them all. Of course, we have to go see them, you know.
Of course you do.
They just became lifelong friends. You know, a family that sends their daughter to America. You know, one of them was a soccer played soccer for South Dakota State University. We still keep in touch with. Just, I mean, we'll all keep in touch with all of them, but it's just it was such. The employees were just such a blessing to us. I mean, they were just starting their life, you know, plumb full of it, you know, just wound up tighter and just loved being around them. Just gave so much energy to the place.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great space out there too. So that big, I don't even want to call it a tent because it's the event space and it's, I don't know, what's the square footage of that thing? It's
Well,
bigger
it's
than
like,
my house. It's huge.
yeah, it's, you know, it'll hold 450 people in
Yeah.
a sit down situation. So it's one of the largest venues, except for the First Banks, or what is it? It used to be Swiftel. Center,
Oh,
but
Dakota-made
big
Center or
place.
something.
And of course, you can't beat you know, the surroundings. You know, have a wedding in the vineyard. Why wouldn't you want to do that? You know, so
Right.
they put chairs down into the vineyard and have a little pagoda down there where they have the ceremony. And then people come up to the tent and they have meals and dances and, you know, all the crazy stuff that happens at weddings. And so it's able to put in a bride suite, which when you get the mother or the mother-in-law up to the bride suite, they say, we're having the wedding here. And it's just gorgeous. It's just the most wonderful place. And of course, the groom suite is a deck of cards, a big TV, and a cooler, you know, and a poker table.
And a recliner, maybe? No.
And so and so they come down this stairway into the building, into the event center, and it's just a glorious place to have a wedding, you know. And he's partnered with Hitch from Brookings, and they're the event planners. And so they do all the work with the couple and the family. Where do you want the you know, the gift table, and where do you want the head table? How do you want this set up? They deal with all that with them, and they've just been such a great partner. And Renee was on the chamber with us.
Right.
We started it. So
right.
I mean, that's how I got to know her, and that's how it really started with that. And Dillon just took it to the next level.
Yeah, it's been fun watching Renee Bauman grow her business too, Hitch.
Yeah.
The tasting room then too, it's just beautiful, kind of like a little space to hang out, and there's tables and then there's a bar as well. But also I just wanted to say that you have Dillon's got he has some local meat and cheese, some South Dakota meat and cheese. And so we snacked on, was it Dimmock cheese?
Dimmock cheese, you bet.
And then the meat was coming from Locker where?
Platt, his hometown.
Okay, in Platt.
Platt Locker. Yeah.
Okay. And that was really good too, to have some of that while you're tasting the wine. So
yeah, he doesn't have a restaurant license, so he can only serve prepared foods. So you can't, you know, basically he's making frozen pizzas, but that's not a restaurant. I mean, he's just heating them up for people. So he just started that, and yeah, it's been, you know, the ambiance, and really during COVID, he really took over and said, you know, of course everything was closed in Brookings, and he built that outdoor tasting area. So that summer of COVID, there was, you know, there's this mob of people out there every night because the only place that was open. And
because that's outside of the city. So did the county?
County had no requirements on COVID.
Yay.
So everybody was serving outside. He was serving wine outside. You know? And so it became he got so many new customers by doing that. And he had happy hours, you know, 3 nights a week, and there'd be 40, 50 people out there every night. So he turned the corner on that. He really did. I mean, that was our third tasting room, the one we have now. The one was upstairs in our garage, you know, and then the second one was in our garage. And then we always kid, don't ever send Nancy and I on a trip because we start dreaming about things. And so we came back trip to Florida and says, we need to turn that building into a tasting room. So Dillon and I started whacking holes in the wall and putting in windows and doors, and went to the Black Hills and got those big timbers to build the bar. And Hunter Colony made the stainless steel cover. I mean, that was one winter's project that Dillon and I did together. And it really turned out well.
It's beautiful. And the most important part of going out to Schade Vineyard is Freddie the dog.
Freddie the dog.
Fred.
We had a black lab for many years, Brandy, and she loved people but hated other dogs. And so we had
Oh,
to really tell people, if you're bringing a dog, please keep it in your car because Brandy will kill it. Whatever. But she loved people, and it's just like Fred. You know,
oh.
just the most lovable dog, and people just sit and pet Brandy for hours. But Fred has become that too, and people
Mhm.
just come out to see Fred most of the time.
Right. Drink some wine, pet the dog. I mean, shouldn't every bar be like that?
Yeah, yeah, right.
Oh, Jim, you're so fun to talk to. We'll kind of end it here, but do you have any words of wisdom or just what do you want to say or share before we end today?
Well, I just think we were so blessed on timing. Um, Able to buy that property. I think it's one of the best sites in the world to have a winery far enough out of a
Mm.
city, close to a large, Brookings, where there's just this influx of people all the time. We were just so fortunate. And when I was a kid, we farmed that piece of ground and we never owned it. And it
Oh.
became the Sheldon Cotton I was talking about. His sister had inherited it, and she was married to a pastor, and they lived in Montana, and they were always going to come back and that grove of trees and build a house in there for their retirement home. But they fell in love with Montana and said they weren't coming back. So put me in touch with her, and I said, "This is what some land sold right next to it," and I says, "I'll buy it from you for that on a contract for deed, a good interest rate for them," and that's how we ended up with it. And we still have people coming complaining that was going to be our acreage. I was going to be ours. We always wanted that. We just happened to get right time, right, standing in the right place, at the time.
Mm.
And of course, in 2000, when we became licensed, that was the real start of wineries, the maturing even in California. I mean, wineries in California were kind of the ritzy people, the people that had the gigantic, cellar with all these wines. It was kind
Mm.
of a guy thing. And what really changed, and what I learned we go to the symposium in California every year, the Unified Wine and Grape Symposium. What I learned from them is what was happening when they started selling wine in grocery stores. Women became the buyers of wine, not the guy with the cigar with the poker table. It became women, and women are tremendously loyal to a product. If they like something, you can't get it away from them. And it turned
Mm.
out to be that almost 75% of the wine was purchased by women, since it became into liquor. And you walk into a liquor store and there's 2,000 different kinds of wine. And so when somebody helps them to find something they like, they trust it. And I
Yeah.
think that's where we were probably in the ground level of that when that revolution started in South Dakota. Because at first, like Hy-Vee could only have 3 licenses in the whole state. And that got changed. And so every grocery store can have it. Convenience stores can have it. I mean, those are the things that opened up for us. Timing was just, we were so fortunate, so blessed. And then the kids that worked for us, the people that we were so appreciative of what they did. Couldn't have done it without them. People come and stop and, yeah, we live in Minneapolis. We're going to buy some land out here, and we're going to start a winery, and we'll come out on weekends, and we'll, make some wine, and we'll sell some wine. I go, good luck with that program. So it takes your whole life. I mean, and when you love it, it's not work. When you love what you're doing, it's not work. And so it was fun. Whether you're up at 4 o'clock in the morning crushing grapes, or you're racking wine at midnight, or hauling wine to Rapid City all night long. I mean, when you love it, it's not work. And so just so blessed and so fortunate. And we were at the ground floor of South Dakota Wine. And we had an association. It's still somewhat of an association, but all the wineries were met together. We couldn't agree on marketing. We could agree on policy, but we could never agree on marketing. Everybody wanted to get in front of the other person. I'm going to
Oh.
my table next to the door. Like at the state fair, they have the wine tent every year, of the wine building, and everybody fights for the table right at the front. So it's fun to be somebody walking and says, "Where's Schadé's table?"
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't matter where you're at, they're gonna come get you.
And we hired Paulson Marketing in Sioux Falls to do our label. Originally they all looked alike. And so people could walk into a liquor store and say, "There's Schadé's." We did it on purpose. We branded it that way. Our highway signs were that way. Everything was the same way. And that was, Brian Bierke actually grew up with him in Volga. He played football with Brian Bierke. Used to be on Teleland as a news reporter, but he worked for Paulson, and he was the person that really figured out how to market in South Dakota. And we did it with the same label. Now, fanciful labels are really popular, and Dillon's doing several of them. But our original label was, we wanted to be known. We didn't want to have a cute little name and a cute little bottle that was just wasn't our marketing plan. And that really worked for us, But I know his Buffalo wines out in western South Dakota are just killers. Buffalo Stomp or whatever, Dakota Red, all them are all just really popular. And so he's really taking advantage of that fanciful label process. Same wine, but it's marketed a different way.
Yeah. So. Yeah, the bottles look great. I buy them. I'm a woman. I'll be loyal.
Yeah, it's amazing to learn. When I learned about that, it was like, oh my gosh. And one of the fun things we got to meet Jay Lohr, and when we go Unified, he would buy all the South Dakota people their lunch at this Unified Symposium. I mean, he's like the 18th largest in the world. I mean, here's us yahoos having lunch with Jay Lohr, and these people go by, what in the world? Who are these people? And he kind of tipped us off on, your association will never agree on marketing. Don't even bother. Just agree on public policy. That's how the grocery store and the convenience store license became available. They can sell South Dakota wine and beer for the same license, which is what convenience stores do. So it really helped. It really helped us.
Sure.
But he kind of instigated that. This is what you need to really think about: how you can get along, not how to fight. Because he says wineries in California fight for shelf space. Everything is shelf space.
Sure.
Like most of the tasting rooms. There's 5,000 wineries in California for Pete's sakes. And there's not that much shelf space.
Right.
So, and we were fortunate that way. We were one of the first.
Yeah. How many wineries are there in South Dakota right now?
I think we were the largest when you consider South Dakota fruit. Prairie Berry probably does the most volume, but they import, most of their grapes come from out of state.
Okay.
They're probably the largest. So that's for sale. Their wineries for sale. And then there's, Straw Bale used to be at Brandon or at the Renner. They've closed. There's several others that have been around a long time. Valiant down in Vermilion still operating, but there's kind of some attrition that's going on. Most of us started, we were too old when we started. We should have started in our 20s. So I'm really glad that Dillon is young.
Yeah.
He started in our 40s and 50s, So anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
That Sheldon, so your friend, does that go back to the girl who got married, the first wedding? Is that the same
That's
Sheldon
his daughter.
family?
Yep.
Yeah.
Blind
You
together.
got suckered.
He taught me. He used to make, when he worked on his farm out west of Volga, he'd make apple wine, and of course we'd imbibe in it from time to time, and then we kind of jointly started gathering all this wine equipment. And one day he called me up and said, "This stuff's all going to landfill. You got 24 hours to come and get it. I'm sick of it. I'm done making wine." And so I drove from Pierre all the way down here with a truck and picked up all this stuff and hauled it back to Pierre. And that's how Schadé Vineyard started. I'm telling you, that's how it started. That I got all this equipment, and then I started making wine in my basement. And then it just went out. Just fortunate after that, the way things turned out.
All right. Thanks, Jim.
You bet.
I think that we would have really enjoyed Jim and Nancy's inventory reduction parties. To learn more about Schadé Vineyard and Winery, go to schadévineyard.com. That's SCHADE vineyard.com. They're also on Facebook and Instagram. And you can go visit their location, go to the tasting room, drink some wine, buy some merch, pet Freddie the dog, and enjoy South Dakota cheese and meats. Their address is 21095 463rd Avenue, Volga, South Dakota. It's just a few miles to the west of Volga on Highway 14. If you're not in the area, though, you can shop for their wine and have it shipped to you. They also have Aronia juice, which we forgot to talk about. It's packed with nature's antioxidants, so you can have that shipped to you as well. You can host your event. You can book your stay through Airbnb. Those links I included in your show notes, in the description, in the app that you're listening to this podcast.